Matthew 24, Birth Pains and Ordinary Tuesdays. Look at the sheer scale of what Jesus is doing here, David said, pushing handout sheet number 1 toward the center of the table. His eyes lit up as he traced the diagram of Herod's temple complex with his finger. Matthew is my absolute favorite gospel because it frames Jesus as the true king. For a first-century Jew, this temple was the footstool of Yahweh, the center of the universe. And Jesus looks at these massive marble blocks and gold plates and says, "Not one stone will be left upon another." It's an imperial judgment. But notice what happens immediately after they cross the valley to the Mount of Olives. The disciples drop a two-part question on him. When will this happen? And what is the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? They think the fall of the building and the end of the world are the exact same event. Jordan leaned forward, his finger resting on a cross-reference in his margin. Right, because in the Jewish apocalyptic worldview they grew up with, you literally couldn't conceive of the sanctuary falling without the cosmos collapsing along with it. To them, if the temple dies, the world dies. Caleb and Maya shifted closer to the table, their eyes darting between Jordan's open Bible and the timeline layout on David's handout, listening intently but staying quiet as the historical framework began to lock into place. Exactly, David nodded, turning the page to pivot the group into the next major concept. So Jesus begins by giving them a grid for the long haul. He talks about birth pains, wars, famines, earthquakes. But look at verse 6. He says, "See to it that you are not alarmed. The end is still to come." A woman in labor doesn't deliver on the very first contraction. These upheavals are just the background noise of a fractured world. Arthur let out a soft, heavy sigh, taking off his glasses to wipe them with his handkerchief. David, thank you for emphasizing that. In my 72 years, I've lived through so many end times panics, I've completely lost count. Every time a war breaks out in the news or a major fault line shifts, people start printing charts and predicting next Tuesday. They completely miss the restraint Jesus is calling for here, Marcus added, tapping his pen against his notebook. It really paralyzes people. From a practical standpoint, if you convince yourself the world is ending next month, you stop practicing long-term Christian stewardship. You stop investing your life and resources. You just bury your talent in the dirt and wait. Elena nodded slowly in agreement, and it leaves people incredibly vulnerable. When your personal life feels chaotic, a sudden societal panic makes you desperate for any false certainty someone throws at you. Jesus' first command here isn't a date, it's watch out that no one deceives you, which brings us straight to the absolute center of gravity in this whole discourse. Verse 15, David said, gesturing for everyone to look back down at their first handout sheet. Jesus talks about the abomination of desolation. To the disciples sitting on that hill, that wasn't a futuristic riddle. It was a living historical nightmare. They all knew about Antiochus Epiphanes back in 67 BC, how he banned the Torah and sacrificed a pig on the altar. They celebrated Hanukkah every year specifically to remember the cleansing of that horror. So when Jesus says it's going to happen again to this temple, it's a psychological bomb. But look at the middle column of your handout. I put Luke 21:20 right next to Matthew 24:15. Look at how Luke translates it for his Gentile readers. Jordan interjected, picking up the thread. Luke completely strips away the Hebrew apocalyptic idiom, where Matthew says, standing in the holy place. Luke writes, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then know that its desolation has come near. The abomination manifests when pagan Roman legions encircle the city walls, carrying military standards they literally worship as idols. David leaned over the table, his voice tightening with the urgency of the text, and Jesus tells them that when they see those armies, they need to run. Don't pack a bag, don't go back inside the house, just run. Jordan continued, keeping his voice punchy. The incredible thing is that they actually did it. The church historian Eusebius records that when the Roman general Cestius Gallus inexplicably paused his initial siege in AD 66 and pulled back, the Christians in the city recognized the exact sign David just pointed out on the handout. They didn't stay to fight a holy war. They fled across the Jordan River into the mountains of Pella. They were entirely spared when Titus came back and destroyed the city in AD 70. Sarah looked down at her Bible, her voice dropping into a quiet, heavy cadence that made Caleb and Maya look up instantly. Verses 19 and 20 always break my heart. How dreadful it will be for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray your flight won't be in winter. When we talk about the grand military history of the Roman siege, it's easy to treat it like a textbook, but as a mother, I read that and see the raw, visceral human suffering of trying to drag toddlers and infants through a frozen mountain pass to escape a war zone. It brings the prophecy right down into the dirt. The room went quiet for a moment, the weight of the text settling over the table before David gently shifted them onto the next handout sheet to confront the timeline text. Let's look at the next big hurdle on handout sheet number 2. Verse 34. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. Jordan, break down the linguistic parameters for us here. Jordan adjusted his notes to explain. The Greek word is geneia. Historically and grammatically, scholars generally split it into 3 paths. First, it can mean the literal eyewitnesses standing there, meaning verses 4 through 31 were completely fulfilled by the catastrophe of AD 70. Second, it can mean a race or people group, meaning the Jewish nation will be preserved through history until the end. Or third, it means the specific future generation that sees the final signs begin to converge. Martha reached over, her face softening as she nodded along with Jordan's notes, her seasoned voice carrying a warm tone of agreement. That linguistic breakdown is exactly right, Jordan, and looking at those precise word definitions really gives us a firm place to stand. When you couple that legal precision with the parable of the fig tree right above it, you see how beautifully it all connects. Jesus isn't handing us a calculator to fight over exact dates. He's taking those structural frameworks and using them to cultivate our spiritual awareness. He wants us to look at the world around us with that same careful eye and recognize the season we are in, so we're living awake. That's the perfect transition to the final gear shift of the night, David said, closing his hand out and leaning forward to address the ultimate application. Look at the massive structural trap Jesus sets in verse 36. Everything we've talked about so far has been about watching for visible signs, armies, history, changing trees. But in verse 36, the language flips entirely. But about that day or hour, no one knows. He compares his ultimate return to the days of Noah. Life is completely, boringly ordinary. People are buying groceries, eating dinner, planning weddings, total normalcy. And then the flood hits out of nowhere. The first half of Matthew 24 is about an event you can see coming if you watch the geopolitical signs. The second half is about an event that gives absolutely zero warning. David looked across the table, catching the intense, focused gaze of Caleb and Maya to finish the study. True readiness has nothing to do with chasing the speculative end times panics that Arthur talked about. According to Matthew, true readiness is found in steady, unglamorous daily faithfulness, because the king returns on a day that looks like a completely ordinary Tuesday.